we have people still logging in. It is 1 o'clock and we'll proceed because we have a lot to talk about today. I'm Libby Murphy and I'm the Director of Program Development for Vision Serve Alliance. And we welcome you to part one of our transportation webinar series, Putting Mobility in Motion, the Potential, Promise, and Pain of Public Transportation, that's presented by Vision Serve Alliance, Aging and Vision Loss National Coalition, and the Alliance on Aging and Vision Loss, a special interest affiliate of the American Council of the Blind. So thank y'all. And we'd like to ask Lee Nasehi, President and CEO of Vision Serve Alliance, to give us a few words.
Thank you, Libby. Well, all I want to say is this is a wonderful opportunity. We're thrilled to have so many of you join us today. And really, I want to thank the Aging and Vision Loss National Coalition committee members, the Alliance on Aging and Vision Loss, and many of our coalition members for putting this together. This is what collaboration looks like, and we are thrilled. Lots of great things happening. So this is the first of our series on transportation. Sit back, enjoy, and be prepared to jump in with questions when it's time to do that. Back to you, Libby.
Thank you, Lee. A couple of housekeeping notes for everyone. This webinar is being recorded and it will be available in a few days along with the slides. And so that's item one. Item two is if you have questions, and please do have questions, we know you have them, just put them in the Q&A box. We will have a Q&A session after each presenter's talk so that we can keep those questions addressed to that particular presenter. So, and then we will answer those questions at the end of each of those presentations. We have a packed program today, so we're going to get to it quickly. All of our speakers are widely known for their particular fields of expertise and their expertise in some niche areas, which is why they're here today, and we're fortunate to have them. Our speakers are, in reverse speaking order, Nancy D. Miller, Executive Director and CEO of Visions, Services for the Blind and Visually Impaired in New York. Denise Jess, Executive Director, Wisconsin Council of the Blind and Visually Impaired in Wisconsin. And Ron Brooks, Founder and CEO of Accessible Avenue, Accessible Mobility for Everyone, who will now kick off our program. Ron, it's all up to you.
All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this webinar. And I'm really excited to be kicking off this session and the webinar series, The Pain, the Potential, and the Promise of Public Transportation. And I want to just clarify, this is not a promise of potential pain. Those are three separate things. Transit offers tremendous potential. It offers tremendous promise, and sometimes it offers us a little bit of pain. So my role in this presentation today is to really talk about what is public transit and where is it going. And we wanted to start there just because it is a topic that there's a lot of knowledge and there's also a lot of confusion because it means the term public transit means different things to different people. And certainly where is it going? And that doesn't mean like where is the bus down the street going, but it's where is this industry headed? We've been through a time of tremendous change. We're still in it. We'll be in it for a long time. And things are starting to look a lot different than they used to. Next slide, please. So just a little bit about me. I am a 29-year veteran of the public transit industry. And all of my experience has been in the areas of accessible transit for folks with disabilities, as well as paratransit, which of course is really a subset. So I've been focused on this for my whole career. I started back in the Bay Area in 1993 working for BART, which is a regional rail provider in the Bay Area. And I was working on key station accessibility and trying to figure out how to make this system work better for folks with disabilities, including people who are blind or visually impaired. Spent a little time in South Florida, spent some time in New Mexico, a little bit more time in the Bay Area, over to Illinois for a while, and I've been in Phoenix now for about the last 16 or 17 years. Trust me, it's gorgeous here, no matter what they tell you. And we have our family here. So So this is really home now, and we've been working pretty hard, on transportation here as well. 2 years ago, I created an organization called Accessible Avenue, which provides consulting and training services to the transportation industry, and that includes agencies, providers, and also some of the technology players that are starting to bring new products to market. A couple of weeks ago, I just started a new part-time gig with a company called Userve, which is providing on-demand paratransit in kind of like think Uber and Lyft, but paratransit. And that's one of the things we'll talk about, not so much Userve, but that model of service is one of the things that we're starting to see come into the paratransit space. So I have all that experience, but I also have a lifelong of lived experience as a person who is blind. So, I've got my huge stack of Braille notes that I'm not sure how I'll get through in the next 20 minutes. I'm living this dream with all of you all. I understand from personal experience the challenges of using public transportation as a person who is blind. Both in terms of just the challenges of actually just doing it, the way that it impacts our lifestyle, the choices that we're able to make. With my wife and I, we've raised a family, dealing with the kinds of issues that we all deal with on a regular basis. So this is personal as well as professional. Next slide, please. So with all this experience, I've learned a lot. And I just want to share a couple things that my experience has taught me, both my experience as a person and as a professional. And first, it's taught me that the transit industry has very good intentions around accessibility. And this is not always what people believe. I mean, I often hear people believe that transportation people and the people who provide these services, they're out to get us. They're making our lives miserable, and it's purposeful. I mean, I've actually heard people joke about them staying up at night to think of ways to torment us. And my experience is different. My experience is that the people who work in this field want to be here. Most of them aren't making a ton of money. They desire to do good. They have good intentions. And they don't always land. Another thing is that legal compliance is not enough to ensure good quality, accessible transportation service. And we hung our hats on the ADA. I was just starting my career as the ADA was getting started. And I think there was a belief and a hope that the ADA would transform mobility. And it's changed it, but it has not transformed it. And in fact, what we've seen is that the industry has inadvertently targeted the bottom, where they've targeted compliance. And as a result, we largely have legally compliant service that doesn't really meet our needs in many situations. So that's a big focus of my company, Accessible Avenue, as to how to get the industry to stop looking at the bottom and start looking at the rest of it and going beyond the floor to the rest of the building. And then finally, most blind and visually impaired people and most people working in the blindness, low vision community, they really need more information around how public transit is, what it is, how it works, how it's funded, what it costs, what the laws require and what they don't, and how to advocate given all those considerations. Next slide. So here's what we'll cover. We're going to dive right into those issues. And that's really the whole point of this entire webinar series, is to dig into a lot of these topics. But what I'm going to focus on first is the size and shape of the industry. I'm going to talk about traditional transit services like bus and light rail and paratransit, all those things that we've talked about for decades. I then want to talk about new and emerging transportation services, because we have a lot of things happening in the industry, things that are new, things like on-demand transportation, microtransit, which is a form of that, and some other things. I want to talk about some emerging trends and in the areas of service and policy that are happening right now. And then we'll dig in a little bit to the specifics of how the industry is regulated, how it's at the federal, state, and local level, how it's funded and what it costs, and then implications for advocates. So we're going to try to get through all that. I'm not sure if we'll make it, but we're going to do our very, very best. Next slide. So let's start with the industry's big. It is a large, large industry. In 2019, I've got some statistics here, which I'll walk through. 2019 is the year we always quote because it's the last year that wasn't wrecked by the COVID-19 pandemic and the shutdowns and everything that happened. 6,800 agencies and providers delivered service with a workforce of more than 450,000 people. We delivered as an industry 9.9 billion with a B one-way trips. And we spent about $80 billion of money to do that. And those are huge numbers. Those, by the way, come from the American Public Transportation Association, which is the trade association that represents the industry with Congress and in terms of legislation and information gathering. So they are the voice of the industry. These are their numbers. And as big as those numbers are, the same data shows that 45% of Americans are not well served by public transit. And I suspect that many people in this webinar and maybe on this stage live in communities that aren't especially well served by public transportation. So we have a lot of work to do. Next slide. So for the next few slides, I want to take a deeper dive into what I'm calling traditional transportation. So these are the traditional transit services that have been around literally for decades. This is where the industry was in 1990 when the ADA was passed. And it's where some agencies still are, but these are the traditional. So we'll start with fixed route transit. So fixed route transit, this is an important term because it triggers ADA paratransit, which we'll talk about in a second. Fixed route transit includes bus, light rail, streetcar services, and basically the key defining factor of fixed route transit is that it operates on a route and it operates on a schedule. So if it's on a route and a schedule and it runs all day, it's fixed route transit, and that's important. Now, for the most part, fixed route transit is accessible for people who are blind or who have low vision, the system itself. The challenge that we have with fixed route transit is you have to go to it. And that is where we have a huge challenge in many communities, because even though the system itself might be accessible, the buses are okay, the drivers often, not always, but often call stops. So it's largely usable. It's getting to it and getting from it are huge challenges. Next slide. Which is a segue into the next mode, which is called paratransit. We've all heard it. Some communities call it dial-a-ride or whatever. Paratransit is a legally required service for any transit agency that provides fixed route transit. And paratransit is really the service that's designed to mirror fixed route transit for people with disabilities who cannot use public fixed route transit. And the reasons that people may not be able to use it can include, first off, they have to have a disability that prevents it. It can't just be because you live too far. But if you have a disability that prevents your ability to use transit, it could be because it's just not accessible to you. It could also be because you can't get to and from it. Maybe it's a wide street that's unsafe to cross. Maybe it's a long stretch of street with no sidewalk and it's unsafe to travel because of traffic. So there are reasons why that you cannot get to and from public transit. That is a reason that paratransit is available. So by law, paratransit operates when and where fixed route transit operates. It is typically advanced reservation, as in the next day. You have to call a day ahead. Shared ride service, meaning that van that picks you up is picking up other people along the way. Some days it might pick up 2 or 3. Some days it might pick up none, which of course means you have no idea how long your trip is going to take. That's paratransit. And I would say that up until very recently, most systems, not all, most systems stuck to what the law has pretty much required. And I will tell you that we could talk about any of these services for a couple of hours. We don't have that time, obviously. This isn't the class for that, but there are definitely a lot of rules and restrictions around paratransit. that the law requires, and agencies can always do more. But again, as an industry, we've tended to focus on doing what the law requires, and we don't always do a good job at going beyond that. Next slide. The last of what I'll call the traditional service is commuter transportation. And commuter transportation can kind of look like fixed route, but there are some exceptions. It is service that is specifically designed to get people primarily from suburban areas, from kind of outlying areas in a community into the city center, usually for work trips. It could serve a university, it could serve a downtown corridor, it could serve a major shopping destination. But the idea is that commuter transportation is for commuters. It's for people getting back and forth to work. It is typically provided in buses and trains, depending on the city that you're in. And these aren't the little light rail trains, these are like big trains, like choo-choo trains. And then buses, motor coaches often are used. Services are typically operated morning and evening. They go in the direction of rush hour traffic. And again, the purpose is to get people to and from work. Key thing about commuter transit, it does not carry a requirement for paratransit. So the service itself should be accessible. It should be designed to be accessible for people with disabilities. However, if people with disabilities cannot get to it, there is no requirement for paratransit. And that's cooked right into the ADA. It's been that way since the beginning. So that's something to keep in mind. And as we talk about advocacy, that's a very interesting point, that we want blind and visually impaired people to go to work, and we don't require an accessible means for them to do so if they can't use what's there for everybody. Next slide. So talking about new and emerging service models, a lot is happening in the industry over the last, I want to say 10 to 15 years. The industry has begun to implement some new services. These are accelerating coming out of COVID. As the industry is starting to come back, it doesn't look the same. It'll probably never look quite the same as it did before because people's work patterns have changed so much. But these new service models are there for keeps. I mean, these are coming and they are impacting service in a significant way. We're starting to see a lot of on-demand transit types of services where and sometimes they're they're geared for people with disabilities. Often they're not. They're just services that are put out for commuters often. These are services that typically are going to allow you to use an app to request a trip, and a vehicle will come and pick you up and take you, usually short distances. These are often services that connect people to rail system or to the bus system, but they're basically meant to extend the reach of transit into areas that have lower density, where there's people taking trips that are maybe not as frequent as regular bus service in an urban core. And they take shape, take different shapes. There's microtransit, which is it's almost always app-based. It serves a small area. It works just like paratransit, except it's with an app and it's on demand. Most agencies also allow people to call to use those services, but primarily it's geared around an app and a vehicle that's tied to that app. First and last mile solutions, these are typically grouped into services that are geared around a transit center or a park and ride lot or a train station. And very often these could take the form of a discount code that is in partnership with Uber or Lyft or both, where a customer gets off the train and they can use Uber or Lyft or a service like that and get a discount to go maybe up to 3, 4, 5 miles. So those are the kinds of services. We're also seeing bike and scooter rental programs that come along with public transit. Those are kind of ebbing and flowing. I think the industry is still trying to find its way with those services. So those are out there as well. Next slide. A couple of things about these new models. They are largely not regulated by federal law. I mean, they have to be accessible. They have to meet certain requirements, but they're not. They weren't they didn't exist when the ADA was written, so they're not covered specifically by ADA other than the agencies can't discriminate. So all of the decisions about these services are made locally. Fares, service policies, when and where they operate, all those things happen locally. There's no accompanying requirement for paratransit for any of these services at all. So, and that's important because as we come out of COVID, we're seeing more and more of these services, and we're seeing less and less traditional service, which means that the paratransit obligations are shifting. So it's important for advocates to be paying attention. Next slide. So just some trends, and I know I'm running tight on time. So just a couple of trends here. One of the things we're seeing is that the current administration, the Biden administration, has a heavy focus on zero emission vehicles and a priority around equity, diversity and equity. And equity is important because that term often, it always refers to color, to skin color, to ethnicity, to race, to gender and gender identity. It also applies to disability, although the rhetoric around disability isn't as developed. So it's really important for us as advocates to be talking in the space of equity, because how that equity is defined is going to matter in terms of how services are ultimately shaped. We're seeing an increasing use of mobile technology. That's super important, obviously, because that technology may or may not always be accessible or available. We need to make sure that it is, because it's affecting people. We're definitely seeing a shift from what I would call modal transportation, bus, rail, to more of a focus on how do we get people from point A to point B. I think that's a good change overall, but it definitely creates some challenges. So agencies are starting to integrate services with each other. They're starting to look at the journey that a person makes, as opposed to, how looking at their trip on a bus or their trip on a train. They're looking at their whole trip and trying to figure out how to make those work better. Next slide. So how services are regulated. I'm going to go super fast here, and so we can try to have some time for questions. Federal laws, and I would say this is also true on the next slide for state law, is often focused around regulating minimum requirements. So what federal law basically does is it sets the floor. So these are the minimum requirements that your service has to meet in certain areas. So we have federal laws that address non-discrimination and basic accessibility. There are some federal requirements around driver background checks and training, specifically around drug and alcohol usage. There are protections for labor and for third-party contracting, so that agencies have to meet certain requirements to have, when they want to contract out for service. There are requirements around environmental compliance and management and reporting. The state laws basically vary widely by state. Next slide. And these vary widely, but they tend to regulate. They often provide additional protections. And you see this, I'll use California as an example. They extend additional protections for labor. They set some wage standards within the state. They have some additional environmental requirements. So that's what state law tends to do. Next slide. So this is really the important slide here. Everything about how service operates, what it costs, where it goes, who provides it, all those decisions are local decisions. Everything happens locally in terms of how transportation looks and feels to customers. As long as the agency meets the minimum requirements that come out of the feds or the state, they can kind of do whatever they want in terms of service. And that has huge implications for advocates. Next slide. So cost and funding, this is just a real short message here on this slide. Transit services are subsidized. They are not money makers. No transit service at any level makes money. They are subsidized by taxpayers. And in most cases, riders pay a relatively small portion of service. And this is important because it basically means that communities have to support it. It's not enough for the riders to like the service. The whole community has to like it because they're paying for it. And just one number, there's a couple on this slide, and I'm glad we're going to share the slide. 20 to 50% of fixed route transit services are paid for by passengers. On paratransit, because it's a costly service, the riders pay only about 5 to 10% of the cost of service. So 90 to 95% of the cost of paratransit is coming from taxpayers. And that's important because it's the most expensive service that agencies provide. It's the one they least enjoy providing because it is costly, which means that the advocacy efforts have to recognize that it's expensive. And we have to find ways to address that as we advocate. Next slide. I'm just federal funds. I'm going to hit highlights here. Federal funds are basically used to buy stuff for the most part. So they pay for vehicles, facilities, technology. Basically, if it's a thing, you can probably use federal money to pay for it, but typically it's going to require a local match. Local match money tends to come from states, or it can come from local government, but federal money almost always requires a match. Next slide. Some states provide funding for transit, some don't. It's important to know what your state does, and state money is often used as match, but it can also be used for operations in some states. I live in Arizona. We don't have federal fund or state funds for transportation operations. Some states do. But that's something that advocates can definitely take a look at. Next slide. So with regard to, and I kind of skipped over local funding, the local governments pay for most of transit costs. It's paid for with taxes, it's paid for with bonds, typically for facilities and things like of that nature. And it's paid for with revenues that the agencies are able to come up with, and of course, passenger fares. Which means that most decisions are made locally and most money is paid locally. So local advocacy, again, super important. On this slide, and we should be on slide 20 now, implications for advocates. At the federal level, advocacy should probably really just focus primarily on making sure that the federal laws and federal funding are designed in such a way that that our interests are protected and that minimum standards cover the things that we need them to cover. At the state level, I think advocates there's a lot of room to kind of work on different things, but one of the things that state advocacy efforts can do is to try to address things that cannot be addressed federally. One example I would give is paratransit rules. It's going to be very difficult. For example, paratransit, you're allowed to charge a customer twice as much to use it. I have concerns about that from an equity standpoint. That's not going to get solved at the federal level anytime soon, but a state could certainly pass a law to say that there has to be fair equity between paratransit and bus transit, for example. Those are state level efforts. Next slide. This is where the rubber hits the road, local. Advocates at the local level, this is where you have the most impact and where the most work needs to be done. Advocating for what does the service look like? What should it cost? How should it be paid for? How is it going to be delivered? And what are the long-term funding priorities that our region needs to be addressing? Those are all local questions, and that's where the community needs to be focused and engaged. And this is my last slide with content. These are just other efforts that local advocates can take on, attending meetings and speaking up, serving on boards and committees, and not just the accessibility board, but also, boards and committees that actually oversee the service and make decisions and funding and all that sort of thing. Finding partners, we're going to talk about that in one of the other webinars in this series. Coming to the table with solutions and not just problems. And then obviously partnering with the agency to try to find money and try to address challenges that the agencies have as we work to address the challenges that we have. So that's it. My last slide is a question slide, and I don't think I probably left any time for questions, but we'll get to as much as we can.
Okay, we do have a couple minutes, and Mary Worstel has asked, and this may be addressed further in a future in one of the other two seminars or webinars, and she asks, to what extent has our community collaborated with senior organizations to advocate or address the gaps in transit access and in equity for older adults?
Yeah, definitely. Let's hold that, because there are people who can speak better to that than I can. But yeah, that's definitely an important topic.
Okay, and if you don't mind, to keep us on time, we'll go ahead and go to Denise.
Mhm.
Thank you, Ron.
Thank you.
And thank you, Denise.
Yeah, you bet, Libby. Ron, thank you so much. Good afternoon or morning, depending, I guess, on where you are in this gorgeous country. I'm Denise Jess with the Wisconsin Council of the Blind and Visually Impaired. And my focus, I really appreciate Ron giving us the big picture view on transportation. And I'm going to walk us down to street level at this point to look at the issues that are faced by those of us with vision loss when we access the transportation system. A lot of what I'm going to share is going to be very familiar, especially to those of us that navigate it daily. What we'll do is couple that with what are some of the remedies that, when put in place, can be game changers for those of us that are transportation users, that we can advocate for, in our organizations, that we can train our staff to help advocate for, and most importantly, train our constituencies to advocate for. Yes, and we can go ahead to the next slide. So advocacy, I think, is rooted in my bones. I don't know how to move through the world without advocating. My major part of my career has been as an educator and advocate. The last 6 years have been spent as the executive director for the Wisconsin Council of the Blind and Visually Impaired. I have a very strong bias that those of us living with vision loss need to be in every aspect of our communities, and that needs to be really normalized, that we have a right to sit on our transportation commissions in our communities. And I'm very proud to serve in that role here in the city of Madison, where I live, that we have important perspective to offer that actually increases the inclusion for all people when our voices are at the table. So I'm very much bring a notion of collaboration and being at the table into the work that I do in building those partnerships and coalitions, which is something that I think I'll be talking about in session 3. So I won't get diverted by that now. So we can go ahead and go to the next slide. I want to use a framework for my comments called the Complete Trip Framework. And this is a step-by-step from the moment that someone notices that they want to get from point A to point B, the getting there and arriving at the destination. And I'm choosing to use this framework because so much of the experience for the transportation user, it encompasses all of these things. Sometimes we segregate it to the bus ride or the paratransit ride or the van ride from the senior center or the volunteer driver program, but it's a whole thing. And we know that when our constituencies have positive experiences in the complete trip paradigm or framework, that they're more likely to use transportation services again and feel okay about using them, feel safe about them. So I want to be really inclusive in our conversation. So everything from planning and booking the trip to traveling to the transit stop if it's not door-to-door service, riding the transit, bus, train, van, whatever it might be, and then crossing the street if that is a part of the trip experience, the pedestrian portion of the experience, and then arriving at the destination. And as we visit each place along the framework, the first slide that I'll visit is what are some some of the challenges that are presented to those of us with vision loss, and this includes our older adults and other folks with disabilities. Some of these are universal challenges. And then more importantly, I'll focus on what are some of the solutions that create access and how do we go about advocating and strengthening our voices around them. So we can go to the next slide. When we need to, let's see, we're still on the complete. There we go. Yay, thank you. So planning the trip, as Ron mentioned, it often requires, if you're using volunteer ride service, driver service, medical, non-emergency medical transport, or paratransit, it does require booking in advance. And that is, I didn't list it here, but that is a significant challenge. For some services here in the state of Wisconsin, you have to book the ride a week in advance. So please plan your virus, okay, folks, so you can get to the clinic, with a ride as you need it, or plan when you're going to be out of milk, so you can make that grocery store run. So that is a huge barrier for those of us who use transportation services, to have to book so far in advance, and then sometimes to have those rides cancel just up to the point when we're ready to walk out the door. Additional ones are that many of the scheduling tools, whether there's print schedules themselves, or an app-based schedule, or a website based scheduling tool, simply are not designed with screen reader or magnification or high contrast in mind. So then that reduces our ability to do that independently and privately. We also know from our work that there's a lack of training opportunities for folks, no matter how hard we are working in our agencies, that there are so many folks that don't have the necessary skills to use access technology to make these trips and plan them. And then there's a fear of outing oneself that I think we all know really, really well. So if someone has to ask for help in scheduling the trip, will they maybe not schedule it because they don't want to have to out as someone with vision impairment? And next slide. So what are some of the ways that we can create greater access? One is of some of the obvious, creating large print materials, screen reader accessible websites and apps, phone support beyond the standard business day, and mobility managers. So the first three often are things that we working in the field of blindness and vision impairment need to come up to bat to advocate for. I have a strong working relationship with our transit provider here, and we'll often give them feedback on, the new website, not so screen reader accessible, or they'll seek feedback from me on how accessible things are, or one of my staff to do testing. So that's one of the areas where we can really step in to advocate to make sure those materials are accessible and available to our constituencies. Mobility, it kind of really feeds into what Ron said about that there's the bare minimum standard according to the ADA, which is often insufficient. And so how we need to uplift that to a greater level of access. Mobility managers, if you aren't familiar with this program, I'm going to highly recommend that you visit this webinar for the second session on June 21st, because one of my colleagues here from Wisconsin will be discussing the mobility management program. These are folks who are experts in knowing how to get from here to there. And so people can work with them to help plan and work out the details on a trip. They're often based at our aging and disability resource centers or other human service organizations, and they are invaluable tools. And there's a lot you'll learn next week about the Mobility Manager program. And we can go to the next slide. So now I've got my trip booked, and I need to, if it's not door-to-door service, I need to get to where I'm going to pick up the bus or the train or even the van if I have to meet someone someplace. And the wayfinding is intensely challenging, as we all know. So getting to from home to the departure location or the transit stop, and then locating the actual transit stop on the correct side of the street. Here in my area, buses often make loops, and I will tell you that it has been on more than one occasion, even as a very skilled transit rider, that I have gotten on the wrong loop, and I've had to go out to the edge of the community and then come back in, which has added time to my trip and maybe has made me late for perfect, thank you. It make me late for my appointment. So how do we address these challenges? And we can go to the next slide. Phone support is really, really critical. Recently, a number of bus stops in our university campus area were under construction, and I wasn't sure exactly where they had been diverted to. So I was able to call phone support with our transit operator and have a very calm and supportive person on the other end of the phone give me the information that I needed. I let her know I was visually impaired and that I would need some extra guidance. She stayed on the phone with me as I crossed a major busy street and made it to the rerouted bus stop. So that phone support, again, as advocates, we may need to be on our transit operators about that phone support, really asking them to even have extended hours. People don't stop using transit at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. So how can that coverage be there? Travel training is really critical in our community. The buses have been the network has been completely redesigned. That redesign will go into effect next year. So I'm highly involved working with the transit operator to build in travel training. Travel training is different than O&M, so I want to differentiate those, but a travel trainer will help someone learn the route from departure to transit stop, and then learn how to ride the transit, know how to get off, know what they're doing when they get off. And that training is really critical. Not all communities offer it regularly. So advocacy there for sufficient travel training, really important. Using bus shelters or notable markings for the transit stop, really critical. In many communities, the transit stop is marked by a sign. And when you cannot read the sign and it's just simply a pole, you don't know if you're standing under a no parking sign or a transit stop sign. So again, this is where our advocacy comes in handy to ask that those be notably marked. Bus shelters are excellent because they also provide shelter, but they're a physical structure that cues me that I'm actually at the transit stop. And then working with our transit providers so that they know that we are out here and can offer more specific orientation and mobility training. We can go to the next slide. We're on the transportation. There are again some challenges for the rider with vision loss. Boarding the bus, the correct vehicle. Oftentimes, especially in downtown locations, there might be a whole lineup of buses. And this is one of the reasons that folks with vision loss often don't want to use fixed route transit, is that it's so confusing to know where the heck is the bus, is this my bus that's going to go to my neighborhood? And so boarding the correct one, locating an open seat, especially during rush hour, huge challenge, and then getting off at the correct stop. So we can go ahead and go to the next slide. So there are some excellent ways that we can advocate for these things to be happening. One is automated announcements. You know, some places are still having drivers verbally call out the stops, which is unfortunate. Some mini transit systems have these automated, both an external announcement that says this is the number 42 bus headed towards, you know, and they give you that location, the internal, you know, stop ahead at, you know, Washington and Maine. And that auditory cueing, it's also available in text on our buses, and so that those who live with hearing loss can be able to see the notification, and I can hear the notification. That was a game changer. Disability aware operators. And again, this is where we as agencies that work with folks who are blind and visually impaired can reach out to our transit operators to offer training with them and to support their drivers in really being successful. Because as Ron said, you know, transit is really interested in being, you know, community minded and creating space for all. But sometimes they don't know what how would look like. So, you know, having folks that greet us as we're boarding, maybe even confirming that we've gotten on the number 42 bus, that point out open seats and can actually describe those, not just say there's an open seat over there, but, you know, on your left-hand side, about 3 seats down, there is an open seat. And that can confirm the stop location before we get off the bus. I have had drivers who will say, you're getting off at East Washington and Livingston. Is that the stop you want? And I'm like, yeah, thank you so much. All right, we can go forward. Once we are off the bus, you know, unless again we are getting door-to-door service, we may need to walk. We are then in the pedestrian mode once again. And as we know so well in this crowd, that crossing the streets is one of the most dangerous things that we do as people with vision loss. And, you know, particularly many of our elders really are, it's terrifying to cross the street. So of course, good orientation and mobility training makes a big difference here. But even as someone who has excellent mobility and orientation skills, street crossing still makes me incredibly nervous because there's a lot in that environment I cannot control, primarily those who are operating the motor vehicles. We can go ahead to the next slide. So there are ways to create greater access. So having transit operators give information to passengers about the, you know, a more accessible stop. I have had transit operators say to me, you know, there's no signalized crossing here. If you get off at the next stop, you've got a signal. And that is just profoundly appreciated by me, because sometimes I don't know that there's not a signal, and I'll get off the bus and realize there's not one. And so then I walk to the next corner to see if there is one, and maybe there's not. And now I've lengthened my trip. So that's a thing that transit operators, we could advocate for that in our training with operators. Communication between transit and traffic engineering is really critical. The Transportation Commission that I serve on in my community, we intersect with transit, traffic engineering, and street design, the engineering folks that do our street design. And we're always in communication with each other to say, you know, that particular intersection is a high risk intersection. We've had, you know, fatalities at that one. So, you know, let's not put a bus stop right there, or if we do put a bus stop right there, we need to signalize we need to signalize that intersection, and even better still, we need to put an accessible pedestrian signal in. So again, focusing on and enhancing those collaborations among the people who are the players is incredibly critical. And then the pedestrian features, and this is where our advocacy can come into play again, is, you know, working with our public works departments to put in pedestrian roadway features that are going going to increase the safety of the pedestrian experience, like truncated curb cut ramps, and the curb cut ramps lined up properly with the crosswalks, accessible ped signals, sidewalks that actually connect destinations instead of sidewalks to nowhere. And we can go to the next slide. Once we arrive at the destination, it's not over yet. So we need to manage wayfinding from either the vehicle or as we're walking up to the building, and wayfinding to get into the building, the correct entrance. And then of course, wayfinding once we're in the building, that locating of the actual entrance, the proper one to the building, and then internal wayfinding. So sorry about that. I just repeated myself. So we can go to the next slide. So some ways to create access around this with door-to-door service is positioning the vehicle for easy transition from the vehicle into the appropriate entrance. I applaud our paratransit operators when they are bringing my colleagues or our constituents to our office, the ones that pull the vehicle up, create a shorter distance between the vehicle door and our entry door, and then they offer sighted guide if someone would like that. They come to the door when they are to pick someone up, and they offer sighted guide again. They're properly trained in it. Not all of our paratransit drivers do this. One company does it far better than another. And so we know that we have an advocacy and training opportunity to help have more consistency for our paratransit drivers in how they offer that door-to-door service. And then again, this is where travel training and O&M are incredibly critical, so that one can enter the move from the vehicle to the building safely and use internal wayfinding. And we can go to the next slide. So this is nearing the end of my time with you, and we'll create some opportunity for questions as well. So I want to close with one of my most favorite Helen Keller quotes, because this transportation, I will say, is complicated. And one size does not fit all. So here in Wisconsin, we have rural transportation, we have tribal needs, we have suburban transportation, we have urban transportation needs, we have pedestrian and bike needs, and we have cross-municipal transportation needs. So it's a complex problem to solve, and requires collaboration and not a single solution. So Helen Keller, her words really resonate with me in trying to parse apart and work towards more equitable and accessible transportation. Alone, we can do so little. Together, we can do so much. So I will pause here and create an opportunity for questions if there are some living out there. I heard a few in the chat, one about the slides. Yes, the slides will be made available after the presentation so that you all have access to them. Are there any other questions living out there that have come into the chat box, Libby, or the Q&A box?
Yes. Yes, in fact, we appreciate Melody Holloway from Columbus, Ohio, who joined us today, and she has several wonderful questions, and I'll go through them quickly because we may not have time to address them all. And her first question is, she uses same-day U-Serve, which is phenomenal for those who can afford it. If we need to travel over 2 miles with payment deducted from a credit card, how can those of us forced to remain living on fixed income afford an on-demand paratransit service?
Yeah. This is where Ron's words around equity really hit home for me. I know I'll be back. I think I'll be back at the third session to talk about some of the coordinated efforts around equity, and I can address that question even more there. But right now, the system is set up that those of us who have economic privilege, and I happen to be in that category, I can pull out my phone, I can call for a lift. I can get that lift to the meeting I need to go to. I can be on time, and I have the $12 that is required for me to pay. My colleagues don't all have that, and my friends don't all have that. It's a major issue about service delivery for those of us who have economic privilege and those of us who do not have economic privilege that we need to really work on.
Okay, so then another question is that given that drivers are overworked and some routes are scheduled illogically, and riders have trouble with availability and affordability of paratransit, how feasible are multiple stops so that we can accomplish multiple tasks?
Yeah, and it really depends on your transit provider and what funding pool that ride is coming from. So if you are using, for example, non-emergency medical transportation, the grocery store is not an option. So it's to the doctor, it's back from the doctor. If you're using work-related transportation, it's to and from work. And here in Wisconsin, we have set up a system that is rooted in failure because we pay for our transportation based on the funding pot that things came out of. So multiple stops generally is not permissible. And so some of the coordinated efforts that I'm working on a state level are really trying to look at how, given the constraints of the funding, how can we do multiple stop transportation that actually meets the needs of the human being who has to go to the doctor and get groceries and go to work. So
Libby,
no answer, but it's yeah. Ron, do you want to pipe in?
I do, and maybe we can hold this till the general because I don't want to eat your time. But this is there is more to be said on this topic. There's stuff happening in this area, so I'd be happy to jump in a little bit.
Good, thank you.
Thank you, and I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of those questions. And Judy Shanley has asked a question that, Judy, if you don't mind, I'm going to hold that off until the Q&A session for Nancy D. Miller. Because this is one that I believe that all three of our panelists can address. So Nancy, thank you for joining us today, and it's all yours.
Thanks so much. I'm happy to be here. I'm the Executive Director, CEO of Vision Services for the Blind and Visually Impaired, which serves all of the southern part of New York, but I happen to live in Jersey City. Jersey City is a suburb of New York City, and I happen to live in an area of Jersey City that is called a transit desert. So basically, I am in an area where if you can't afford a Lyft or an Uber, there is no public transportation within at least a mile of where I live. So I was thrilled several years ago, Jersey City came up with a micro transit alternative for not only residents of Jersey City, but also anybody who works there or travels through Jersey City to get from one location to another. And we are a major hub for transportation into New York City, which is just across the river. I consider it transit for all, but it's called Via Jersey City. It's purple vans and purple cars that are branded, and on the top of those vehicles are advertising areas, which is how some of the service is paid for. It is on demand, it is low cost, it is accessible, and it has been wildly successful and positively adhered to by everybody who is using it. Next slide. Yes, I've been doing this work as CEO for 35 years. My agency serves over 7,000 people a year. I am very involved in the Aging Network, and my focus on transportation has really been from the point of view of non-drivers and pedestrians. Next slide. So what is Via Jersey City? It's on demand, it's dynamically routed, it's mobile app or phone requested. It's basically a shuttle service that takes you from the outer areas of Jersey City into the inner areas where you can pick up the train, the light rail, the ferry services, all the other transit options. It's open to all residents, workers, and visitors. You get a ride to go from point A to point B anywhere in the service zones. And as I mentioned, the priority is given to people who are going from an outer zone to an inner zone, which is the downtown area with the rich transit options, or vice versa, getting off a train or transit or light rail or ferry and then being able to get home or to work. Next slide. It's available from 6 a.m. to 10 p.m. Monday through Friday. On Saturdays, it's available from 8 a.m. to 10 p.m. And again, it's available to anybody. You sign up with the app or you call a phone number. Next slide. Question always is it wheelchair accessible? And yes, you can either request a wheelchair accessible vehicle on the app or you can call. And once you are in the system, they know whether or not you need a wheelchair accessible vehicle. Next slide. So it started as a Monday through Friday service. It was so popular that it expanded to weekend service. It was even more popular, so they have added vehicles. And most of the vehicles now are electric. So it is also helping the environment, in addition to it being an on-demand service for anybody. It has actually helped the underserved communities the most. Next slide. So since its launch, the service has doubled. 51% of the riders report an annual household income of less than $50,000, and 88% of the riders identify as a person of color. Now, Jersey City has a population of 257,000 people, and it is the most diverse city in New Jersey and one of the most diverse cities in the country. So the fact that this is a service that is being used by people of all backgrounds and all ethnicities and all income levels is one of the reasons it has been so successful. Next slide. So there's a mass transit newsletter that featured Via Jersey City. And this is what it said about the service. It's municipal subsidized, on demand. It is a ride share, and it is operated in partnership with Via. Why is it so successful? Jersey City and the mayor knew exactly what goals they wanted to achieve. They knew how to measure them, and they have kept Via to those goals and made sure that everything that was expected has actually been delivered. The number one goal was to address the transit deserts in the city by providing first and last mile connections. But also there are sustainability and environmental goals. Yes, it does receive some federal funding in addition to the city subsidy, but the goal is also that this will be good for the environment. And because Jersey City is right next to New York City, a goal was to reduce the number of single occupancy vehicles that are on the roads with just one driver. Next slide. The design is really critical to the success. So there are service zones, and Jersey City has what we call two downtowns, a central downtown, which is rich in transit and pretty densely populated, and an outer area that is less populated and often has not only fewer but no transit options. So the goal was to make sure that people who didn't have a public bus or didn't have a light rail or a train or a ferry would be able to get to where they could pick up that other public transportation. So the zones are created so that you generally are not going from the outer part to the outer part. You're going from the central part to the outer, or the outer to the central. Rides either have to originate in the outer zone or they have to end up in the outer zone. So again, that was the goal of the city, to get the less populated areas to the more populated where they could pick up other types of transit. Next slide. We're using VIA in-house technology. So they have algorithms that basically determine what the likelihood is of who's going to be using it when, how many vehicles are needed. And the goal was to achieve wait times of 15 minutes or less. And that goal has been achieved. Service launched with 15 branded Mercedes Metris minivans. I think we now have triple that number that are actually working. Local drivers were hired, and they had not only extensive background checks, but extensive training. And that training included how to interact with a person with a disability, not just wheelchair users, but any disability. Next slide. What was really interesting was how Via Jersey City advertised that it was available. So anybody who is signed up for text messages from Jersey City for any reason, changes in parking, where a manhole is being worked on, street closures, any announcement that you've signed up for from Jersey City, the announcement of Via Jersey City came to you. It was advertised in billboards, it was advertised in any city agency that you called. There was an advertisement about VIA. It was on all the local news, radio reports, and the community needed to be educated about how to use the service. If you were going to be using the app, what it was, how to download it, how to book a trip. They also made that phone available during all the hours that the service is working. So from 6 a.m. to 10 p.m., you can call a phone number with a person and book a trip or ask a question. There were key performance indicators, which was basically how many riders were using it each week, what the utilization rate was, so how many vehicles were being used each hour, and the quality of service goal of wait times of 15 minutes or less. Next slide. So Via Jersey City is using and maintaining this service now. It's over 2 years that we've had it. Day-to-day operations are managed by Via. They're using Via technology, which is very similar to Uber and Lyft and other on-demand car services. People can request a trip. They will be directed to, quote, a virtual bus stop. But as a person with a disability, you can identify that, and they will make sure that your pickup point is at a place that you can get to. If available, they will match multiple vehicles who are heading in the same direction, but there are multiple stops. So you don't all go to the same location. They have stops along that general route that a passenger is taking. It has dramatically helped reduce congestion and emissions while providing a much more efficient rider experience, not only for non-drivers, but for people who don't want to drive in a very congested area and pay for parking or deal with the delays as a driver. Riders can pay their fares directly to VIA, and the city subsidizes the rest of the cost. Next slide. So this was the big focus. Jersey City wanted to create an accessible service with affordable fares that was not only ADA compliant with their vehicles and their stops, but went beyond basic ADA compliance. They wanted booking options for people with and without smartphones, and they also wanted payment options for people who are unbanked. Many of the people, especially of low income, living in Jersey City and in many areas, don't have a bank where money can be deducted from. Next slide. So what does it cost? So it is $2 per ride when you're going to or from the central zone, and it's $2.50 per ride if you're going from the outer zone, which is very affordable, even for people of very low income. You can make your payment by the app, or you can use a prepaid voucher. You can book rides using the app or calling a dedicated phone line. Next slide. Safety and security were a major focus. People who are wheelchair users and who need wheelchair vehicles do have direct door-to-door trips. VIA vets every meeting corner. They look at the traffic safety, lighting, crosswalks. And again, if you are a person with a disability, you can ask for a virtual bus stop or a pickup that is convenient for you to get to. Every stop is reviewed, and there is a feedback system. So if you're a user of VIA, you can let them know exactly what's working and what isn't working. Because no credit card information is retained, that's a big security factor. So even if the system is breached, there are no credit cards. The access to the system is secure. It's password protected within the back end system of VIA. Next. So VIA is managing and maintaining the fleet. It will be fully electric by the end of this year. They're the ones who manage when a vehicle goes off the road in order to be recharged, so that they know exactly how many vehicles have to be in operation to meet demand, so that you have no more than a 15-minute wait. They develop all the optimization algorithms. There has been strong demand, and VIA's technology has ensured a very efficient system and very good vehicle utilization. And it is absolutely fulfilling the goal of providing better transit connections to those who need it most. Next slide. So the goal from now is to develop the alternate strategies for long-term sustainability. So advertising in and on the vehicles has become a significant revenue stream. How do you pay for it where it's not coming out of just taxpayer dollars, especially because Jersey City has a very, very large low-income population? Jersey City and VIA collaborate to identify and pursue any transit grants that are possible, whether it's state, federal, private, and that has brought in funding to, again, keep the fares very low and also to keep the taxes low on the Jersey City residents. Next slide. So looking forward, I think as Ron and Denise have talked about, on-demand microtransit has really exploded, not just in the United States, but throughout the world. Transit planners and consultants regularly include microtransit in network redesign projects. Because this has been such a positive experience for people using VIA Jersey City, the assumption is that this is only going to grow. And Jersey City is sharing its data with anybody who's interested. They also have a dedicated administrator in the Jersey City administration who will talk to other communities and municipalities about what Jersey City is doing, all their metrics, why they chose VIA, how it's working, what the experience has been, both from the rider perspective and also from the city perspective. And the reason I'm so gung-ho about VIA Jersey City or programs similar to it, which do exist around many parts of the United States, is for many people who are blind or partially sighted, this has been the best alternative to a paratransit system that both in New Jersey and in New York is basically broken. You end up riding sometimes hours to get to a location that may be only 20 minutes away. It is supposed to be an equivalent system to public transit, but it is definitely not. It is separate and it is not equal. And by having an on-demand system that isn't just used for people with disabilities, it is meeting the needs of older adults, it's meeting the needs of low-income residents and workers and travelers through the city. It's meeting the needs of people with disabilities, with all types of disabilities. And frankly, it's helping the nonprofit agencies that function in Jersey City, where a participant in their program doesn't have to be picked up by a nonprofit's van to get to the center. They can take the VIA Transit, which is very reliable, very secure, very safe, which means that monies that nonprofits are paying for travel now can be deployed on increasing other types of programs. So I am a big believer in microtransit. This is just one example of how it's being used and how it's being used in a way that is not placing the burden of hugely increased taxes on the residents of an area that is basically a commuter corridor to get to and from New York City. Next slide. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Okay, thank you, Nancy. And Judy had earlier asked a question and she was very kind to allow us to defer it to this point. And her question is, I sometimes think there's a silo between the people addressing paths of travel and the transit stations. And y'all all talked about partnerships. So what are y'all's suggestions regarding how to improve these relationships?
So this is Ron. I'll start. And one of the things that I would say is, and I really hope we have time to dive back into equity because we all talked about that as well. And I think it's something I really want to get this group to think about. With regard to this partnership, there is work being done, a little bit of being done in the industry. The industry has had some conversation around the topic of wayfinding. There are pilot projects that have been done around wayfinding. There's a project at WMATA in Washington, D.C. To put some wayfinding technology into some of the train stations in the DC area to test it. There was a pretty well advertised pilot by the transit system in San Antonio, Texas, using QR codes from a company called NaviLens to try to create some wayfinding assistance. One of the big challenges that you have is that the pedestrian environment often lands under city government, and transit services operate under, in some cases under city government, but in many cases they operate under their own authorities. And they don't always, their funding isn't always the same. They don't always have the same decision-making metrics. They don't share the same problem. And so the challenge is, and this is where coalitions are important. It's where local advocacy is important. It's really important to get transit agencies and local governments to recognize their shared concern, and to try to get them to focus on that issue together. But I do think that on the technology side, there is work being done. It's just a question of getting a few more use cases. And I think also getting some more technology growth. A lot of these technology players in the wayfinding space are new. Their technologies are still being developed. In many cases, they're partial solutions. And in my opinion, at least, we still don't have a really good, robust, full scale wayfinding solution that works for the whole complete journey that Denise talked about.
Nancy or Denise, do y'all want to add to Ron's comments?
I think from the point of view of a vision rehabilitation agency that provides orientation and mobility training for people of all ages, we don't have enough orientation and mobility instructors to be able to teach everybody from their door to their destination. But for those who do access our service, that is in fact one of the benefits of getting orientation and mobility instruction, that everybody has a different route, a different way, a different walking path that they need to use. And to be able to have an individualized training that will get you to where you want to go, not a generic place, is, can't be replaced. So the more we can do to support orientation and mobility training and more people to get into the field, because we have a personnel shortage. But it is absolutely the case that we have people who want to work, are ready to work, are legally blind, they've gotten all the work readiness, they have their assistive technology, and yet they can't get to where they need to go in order to get to where the jobs are. So we have a lot of work to do.
I really appreciate both Nancy and Ron's perspectives on this. I think the only other thing that I would add is to start where you already have some potential for relationship. There's not one avenue into this work. Both there's not one avenue in. So if you have a strong O&M team, how can you partner with the travel trainers in your transit operation and build those relationships? If you have a strong connection, in my case, I have a strong connection with traffic engineering, and then how do we build those relationships with our transit providers and our street builders? So, look at where those relationships are already blooming, and then spend the time fostering those and growing them, because good relationship becomes contagious, and then doors open in ways that we didn't even expect. So I would just say really start where you've already got some authenticity and go from there.
this is Nancy again. I would add to what Denise says. We've been collaborating with traffic safety around pedestrian safety. And rarely do they think about the blind population as travelers. They have all their materials available and none of their videos are narrated. They have print materials that are not in large print. Their websites aren't always accessible. So you can enter the system in so many different places. I know that was a question, but traffic safety, pedestrian safety, if you have a state disability officer or a city disability officer, they can often be your partner. We work very closely with our state office on the aging because the very issues that the blind population is dealing with, many of them are exactly the same as the older population, and it doubles our voice. But we've gotten to the point where somebody from the aging network will bring up vision and somebody from the vision network will bring up aging because we're constantly advocating together. So wherever you can enter your system in your locale is the right place.
Yes.
Thank you, everyone. And we appreciate all of you who signed in for this webinar. And again, it has been and is being recorded and will be distributed, as will the slides. You can see here that included in the slides are a list of contacts. So you will have this information in case you want to reach out to Ron, Denise, and Nancy individually or collectively. And we also had a question about if we would be able to continue these discussions beyond webinars. And my answer to that is we welcome people to work with Vision Serve Alliance and our collaborators as we work on this issue. There's more to come about this. We have 2 more webinars. Helen, if you'll advance to the next slide. So the next webinar is on Tuesday, June 21st. And if you haven't registered, you can certainly register for that one and the one on June 29th, where you'll hear more about this. But Sheila is absolutely correct that this topic is far bigger than 3 webinars. So my name is Libby Murphy, and you are welcome to email me, and I put my email address in the chat. If you are interested in volunteering to become more active on this issue and building your own networks. So thank you everyone for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you on June 21st.